Hello everyone, I'm David Shear, an architect and urban planner in Salt Lake City. Today I'm going to be presenting the Utah Inland Port, what Utahns need to know. If it goes forward as planned, the Utah Inland Port will be the single largest economic development project in the history of the state. It will cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. Utahns should know facts about the port in order to decide whether this is a wise investment. So, to start off, what is an inland port? An inland port is an intermodal hub where goods are transferred between trucks and trains. Goods arriving in the area, whether they come from overseas or from other parts of the country by train, are transferred to trucks for local distribution. The reverse is that goods for shipping overseas or to other parts of the country by train are brought to the inland port by truck. It's a port because shipped goods can go through customs here and avoid having to go through them at the coastal port where things are very congested and there can be substantial delays. By using an inland port rather than a coastal port, shippers can save time and money by avoiding these delays. The Utah Inland Port was created by the state legislature in 2018. It covers about 25 square miles, which you can see in blue on the map here. Most of it is within Salt Lake City, and in fact takes up about a fifth of the city's total land area. The Utah Inland Port is controlled by the Utah Inland Port Authority, UIPA, sometimes referred to as UIPA. UIPA is governed by a board of trustees. When the board was created in 2018, it had 11 members, several of whom were representatives of local governments, such as Salt Lake City, that are included within the port area. As of 2022, however, the legislature changed the composition of the board so it now only has 5 members. None of these are representatives of local governments. 2 are appointed by the Speaker of the Utah State House of Representatives. 2 are appointed by the President of the Utah State Senate. So these 2 men, who are elected only to represent small areas of the state which are not within the port, control its development. No one really knows what the Utah Inland Port will contain. It's sure to have a large number of warehouses. It will need infrastructure like roads and sewers and power lines in order to serve the development. It will need a transloading facility, which are cranes to move containers between trucks and trains. The promoters hope it will have some light industry as well. But the fact is that there is no plan for the port. There's no map of the roads or where the infrastructure will run. We would expect a phasing plan because it will take at least 40 years for the inland port to be built out, but there is no plan. In order to make a plan, studies would need to be done to evaluate the port's impacts on things like our traffic, our economy, and our environment. And UIPA has refused to create these studies, commission these studies. And therefore there is no plan. With a lack of a plan, what happens is the development happens on a parcel by parcel basis. This is a very inefficient thing for the agencies that have to provide the site with utilities, because without a plan they have to just provide the necessary utilities for each parcel, and they can't look at the big picture and plan ahead. It might be that the lack of a plan works in UIPA's favor. With no plan and no studies to back it up, it's quite difficult to criticize the port or to evaluate the claims that it makes. What does the Utah Inland Port Authority do exactly? It exists to promote development within the port boundaries. It does this by providing money to developers to reimburse them for the cost of building infrastructure, roads and utilities. All of the land within the port's boundaries is privately owned, and so it is private interests that are getting this money. The largest private landholder in the port is Rio Tinto Kennecott, which is a division of Rio Tinto, which is a multi-billion-dollar international company. You have to wonder why a multi-billion-dollar company needs subsidies to carry out its business. Where does the money that UIPA gives as subsidies to developers and landowners come from. It gets some money directly from the state legislature. In 2022, they received $40 million. But the vast bulk of the money that UIPA has comes from what is called the property tax increment. In creating the port, the state legislature took the bulk of the tax money that is generated by the increase in value of a piece of property and gave it to UIPA. This is money that would normally have gone to support local government, school districts, library systems, and so on. So if, for example, a piece of property is simply grassland in 2018 and a warehouse is built on it that raises its value to, say, $10 million, then UIPA collects the lion's share of the tax on the difference. They have used this money, or the anticipation, I should say, of receiving this money to issue bonds. In 2021, they issued $150 million in bonds that will be repaid by the anticipated revenue from this property tax increment. As I said before, the port is controlled by two leaders of the legislature, neither of whom represents the area where the port is located. So the folks living in the port area and nearby are having their taxes appropriated to pay for its development, and they have no voice whatsoever in how this money is used. The land within the boundaries of the port is still under the jurisdiction of the various towns, cities, and county where it's located. So the question is, could these local governments influence the development of the port? Well, the 2018 law that created the port ensured that they could not do this in three different ways. The first was that the legislation required that local governments amend their zoning laws so that the uses, the activities that were anticipated to take place in the port were allowed in that area. Secondly, they froze the zoning regulations of these governments as they affect the port at the end of 2018 so that no new zoning regulations, no new land use regulations could be adopted. Finally, they gave UIPA the ability to overturn local land use decisions in case something came up to a planning commission or a city council. With these three measures, they effectively took away local government's ability to plan the area of the port. Planning is often done by deciding what types of activities are permitted in certain areas, and also along with that, things like parcel sizes and so on. So the purpose of zoning, as it's used in the United States, and the reason it was found constitutional by the Supreme Court, is that it protects people's health, safety, and welfare by preventing, for example, a rail yard with the noxious fumes that it creates from being located next to a residential neighborhood. By eliminating the ability of local governments to modify their zoning laws, they deprived them of a key tool for protecting and ensuring the health, safety, and welfare of their citizens. What will happen in the UIPA area? As I said before, UIPA has done no planning, so nobody really knows what is going to happen. But there is one thing that appears imminent now that is necessary for the port in order to operate, and that is what is called a transloading facility, where containers are transferred between trucks and trains and vice versa. UIPA presently has plans to build what they're calling a transloading facility in this red area that you see on the map to the right. That yellow area that's directly above it is the existing Union Pacific rail yard. So the plan is for trucks to be in the red part and for trains to be in the yellow part. And this is important because Salt Lake City's zoning code, actually part of it that is still in effect, prohibits the creation of a rail terminal. And that is that's defined as a place where goods are transferred back and forth. What UEPA is trying to do here is by saying on the red part we'll only have trucks and on the yellow part we'll only have trains, they're trying to make it so that the zoning doesn't apply to either parcel separately, and so they can avoid creating a rail terminal, which would trigger a very extensive review process by the city. This is something that requires immediate action to contact your city council person and to talk to or write to the mayor and her staff and urge them not to overlook the fact that when you put these two things together, it creates something that the zoning code requires a special review for. The port's proponents are claiming that high-tech companies will want to locate in the port to take advantage of the ease of shipping that it offers. These companies would have high-paid, highly skilled employees, and these jobs would be very desirable. The question is, how many of these kinds of companies will in fact choose to locate at the port? The port is being touted as an economic development engine, largely for the jobs that it will create. But who will really benefit from the port? We'll look at the jobs in a minute, but one group of people who are definitely going to benefit are the landowners within the port area and their partners. Their success is practically guaranteed by the subsidies that they are receiving from taxpayers. The port's proponents are claiming that good jobs will be created by high-tech companies that will be attracted to locate within the port to take advantage of the ease of shipping that it offers. These companies supposedly would create thousands of high-skilled jobs that pay well and offer benefits. The experience of other U.S. cities with inland ports does not support this claim. What they have found is that the majority of jobs created within their inland ports have been warehouse jobs, which are not especially well paid, carry few benefits, and as evidenced by the high turnover rate, are not found to be desirable by the employees. Furthermore, these jobs tend to be eliminated, or at least severely reduced, by automation in the very near future. So the jobs that the port is most likely to create will be not well compensated and will maybe not very long-lived. Another claim UEPA makes is that development would occur in this area whether UEPA existed or not. This claim has some truth to it because Salt Lake City executed some developer agreements just before the port was created with the two major landowners of the port area north of I-80. And this gives them the right to develop and be assured that there will be no changes in the zoning laws, and also guarantees them tax subsidies. The question then is really, is UEPA helping at all? And without doing any planning, UEPA seems to be contributing very little if the claim is true that development would happen there anyway. Why do developers in the inland port area need subsidies in the first place? One reason is that the area has no infrastructure. As is clear from the picture on the top there, there are no roads, there are no power lines, there are no sewers, no water lines, and developers would have to build all of this in order to make the land developable. Another reason is that the soil in this area is unsuitable for building. It is subject to what is called liquefaction. During an earthquake, the shaking turns the soil into a kind of thick liquid, and the building sinks. This is, I think, God's way of telling you this is not a good place to build. But in order to make up for the bad soil, what companies have to do is to drill foundations very deep into the ground. And this is very expensive. So these two factors contribute to much higher building costs for developers, which is why they ask for these subsidies, why they in fact need these subsidies in order to make this development profitable. The inland port is not confined to the site in Salt Lake City. The state legislature has created what are called satellite ports that are scattered all over the state. It's up to the local counties to apply to become a site of a satellite port, and many have done so. Many of the areas that are being proposed as satellite ports are to expedite the export of oil, gas, and coal. This is perhaps of short-term benefit to Utah's economy, but in the long term, of course, it contributes to global warming, which is responsible to a large degree for the drought which Utah is currently experiencing, the incredible number and intensity of wildfires that we experienced last year, and is something that Utah should be working to mitigate rather than support. Everybody knows that the air in the Salt Lake Valley is unhealthy. Much of the pollution comes from vehicles, both in the form of chemicals that are emitted in the exhaust, but also in the form of particles that are generated in friction when tires rub on roads and in brakes and so forth. The port will make an enormous contribution to air pollution. I've estimated that at full build-out, the port will generate about 69,000 additional truck trips every day and 152,000 additional car trips every day. And UEPA has not agreed to study this issue. Cars and trucks are not the only source of air pollution that the port will create. Since it also relies on railroads, the Union Pacific Rail Yard that it will uses these things called switcher engines, which you see in the picture here. These are old, very dirty diesel vehicles and are used by the dozens to move cars around and form and disassemble trains in the yard. The Utah legislature has tried in the past to incentivize Union Pacific to replace some of these old engines with newer ones that are much cleaner. And in spite of the offered incentives, Union Pacific has refused to do so. So, are we going to have to subsidize another billion-dollar corporation in order to get them to adopt new technology and do less damage to our air? While we're on the subject of air pollution, we shouldn't overlook air traffic. Airplanes are major contributors to air pollution, and the port will increase the traffic at the Salt Lake City International Airport. Another impact of the port will be water pollution. I talked about this a little earlier, how the runoff is contaminated from the paved parcels, and that this runoff carries harmful chemicals into the water. Salt Lake City's west side has the worst air quality in the city. This is due to the inordinate number of industries located there and to the freeways that run through it and around it. Due to its proximity to the inland port, the west side once again stands to become a sacrificial zone to economic development. This is an historic injustice which we must correct. The area of the port north of I-80 is uninhabitable due to the concentration of mosquitoes and other biting insects without insecticide spraying. The wind will carry these chemicals into west side homes and schools, and the chemicals that the Salt Lake City Mosquito Abatement District currently uses are known to be neurotoxins that especially harm fetuses and young children, retarding intellectual development. This is true even in very low concentrations. The inland port area north of I-80 is one of the last major open spaces left in Salt Lake City. The port would destroy this. The open space doesn't show up in business calculations, but it's important anyway. It provides for biodiversity, improves air quality, improves water quality, and it also provides places where people can go to get away and relax and restore themselves a little bit. So in spite of the fact that open space has no dollar value, it has a great deal of value, and we would lose this if the port goes ahead. The Great Salt Lake has been designated an area of hemispheric importance for migratory birds. It provides nesting and feeding grounds for over 10 million birds every year. The wetlands provide shelter for shorebirds, and the drier uplands provide habitat for other kinds of birds. I mentioned earlier the enormous increase in traffic that the port will create. This will have impacts far outside the boundaries of the port. In order to handle all of this additional traffic that will be coming from probably all 4 points of the compass and going to all 4 points of the compass, the state will have to widen roads or perhaps even build new ones. The cost of this is likely to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's a cost that will be borne by taxpayers and is not being accounted for in the costs of the port. The proportion of trucks to cars in the traffic that the port will create will be much higher, and this has impacts on neighborhoods and commuters. The additional truck traffic will make the commute not only longer, but also more aggravating, and will cause neighborhoods in the vicinity of the thoroughfares that serve the port area to suffer from additional noise and diesel fumes from the trucks that are now traversing their neighborhoods. I've talked quite a bit about the impacts of the port on our environment. UIPA is claiming that the port can in fact be quote-unquote green. It's a very vague word, and it's subject to a lot of abuse in some quarters, but let's ask ourselves, could the port actually be green? Could it be sustainable? Before we get into the question of whether the technical means exists to create a green port at this time, we can ask, has UIPA shown a serious interest in making the port more sustainable? One tool that UIPA has at its disposal, that it could use if it liked, is to offer subsidies for developers to use more sustainable equipment and more sustainable building practices in their port developments. This UIPA has not done. They have chosen to use their subsidies to build infrastructure that supports the construction of warehouses that are in no way special or sustainable. They're simply tilt-up concrete warehouses like you find all over the place. So UIPA has really not used the principal tool that it has at its disposal, namely these subsidies, to promote a more sustainable port. In making its claims about a sustainable port, UIPA is placing a great deal of faith in the development of electric vehicles and their ability to reduce the amount of air pollution that vehicles create. Unfortunately, the reality is that electric vehicles are going to penetrate the market pretty slowly. And even with optimistic projections, the U.S. Department of Transportation expects that by 2050, still fewer than half of the vehicles on the road will be electric. This is even more true of trucks. There's far fewer electric trucks proportionally to the number of trucks on the road than there are cars. But also, truck fleets are replaced rather slowly. Trucks are only replaced when they really no longer work economically for their owners. And furthermore, the truck industry has shown itself not entirely on board with the regulations that already exist. They have found ways to avoid the standards that already exist for truck emissions and performance of truck engines. So we can expect the number of trucks to increase even slower than the number of cars, unless there is substantial government investment in electrifying the vehicle fleet. For the foreseeable future, electrified vehicles will not be able to make a significant dent in the amount of pollution which is emitted by port-bound vehicles. In addition, electric vehicles are no better than standard vehicles. In fact, they may be a little bit worse because they're heavier in creating the friction-borne pollution that I mentioned before. Another claim UIPA makes is that it will improve air quality by replacing truck trips with train trips. It's true that trains are much more efficient than trucks per ton of freight moved. However, in the port itself, the number of trucks and trains will not be reduced. because that is where the cargo is loaded and unloaded. Any benefit will accrue to areas between Salt Lake City and the train's destinations. Furthermore, it's questionable whether the economics of shipping freight by rail between Salt Lake City and the West Coast is viable. The economics of shipping by rail depends on distance to a certain extent. The extra time and money spent in assembling and disassembling trains has to be outweighed by the savings once the trains are en route. There's a question as to whether Salt Lake City may be too close to the West Coast in order to realize the benefits of rail transport. So, will the port be green? To summarize what we've just seen, UIPA has not used its subsidies to incentivize more sustainable practices within the port. The port will worsen our air quality. Electric vehicles will be adopted too slowly to make any significant difference within decades, and replacing trucks with trains will not help our local air quality. The port will not be green. If UIPA were serious about mitigating the port's impacts on our environment and improving our economy, it would be conducting certain studies. It's been asked to do this many times by the public. It would be studying its environmental impacts. It would be studying the traffic that it will generate. It would be studying how it will affect human health. And it would be studying what kind of jobs and how many it's likely to generate. It has not studied any of these things. In addition to serious environmental and quality of life issues, UIPA flies in the face of the principles of representative government. There are no elected officials on the UIPA board. The board is controlled by two men who represent districts that are not within the port area. They are free to advance their own agendas without answering to the people whose taxes they are spending and whose lives they are affecting. This is what the American colonists called taxation without representation. The UIPA board has taken steps to limit public discussion in its meetings, announcing them at the very last minute allowed by law, and sometimes even eliminating the public comment period from their meetings. The budgets which they publicize are extremely vague and do not allow the public to understand what their money is being spent on. Utah legislators apparently like this mechanism that allows them to avoid public scrutiny. They used UIPA as a template to establish the Utah Lake Commission in this last legislative session in 2020. There are several actual and potential avenues of legal action to block development at the port. Salt Lake City has filed a suit alleging that UIPA is illegal because it violates a clause in the state constitution that prohibits the legislature from delegating certain powers to private commissions or special commissions. This case is still pending. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, may also come into play at some point. NEPA requires a thorough environmental review of certain projects. Included in that category are any projects which receive federal funding. So far, UIPA has not used any federal money for precisely this reason. But with the flood of money coming from the American Rescue Act and other federal programs, it becomes more likely that at some point they will use federal money and thereby trigger NEPA. The wetlands in the area of the port are also another possible avenue. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is charged with designating wetlands that fall under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. So far, the port has evaded regulation under this law because development has been conducted on a parcel-by-parcel piecemeal basis. No individual project has a significant enough impact to bring these regulations into effect. This is a situation which not only prevents the wetlands from being properly assessed, but also prevents Salt Lake City from efficiently providing utilities to the area. Some way must be found to assess the impact of the port on a holistic basis and not on a piecemeal basis. Finally, the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States is extremely concerned with environmental justice. And the environmental justice issues that I discussed a while ago concern them very deeply. They are aware of the situation here in Utah and will continue to pay attention and monitor any potential environmental injustices. Political and financial interests want us to believe that the port is a done deal, but it's not. For one thing, there's an enormous area north of I-80 that is presently unserved by any infrastructure and is not developable in its present state. If the development of this area could be blocked, it would provide substantial relief to the harms that the port will create. Secondly, the transloading facility, which, as I mentioned, is key to the port's functioning, could be subjected to studies if Salt Lake City decides that it is creating a conditional use, that is, a rail yard. The zoning laws in place in Salt Lake City allow the city to require a variety of studies if a conditional use permit is required. And this could bring to light information that could support the arguments against the port and build public opposition to its continued development. Public opposition to the port has been very vocal and is growing, and this is in fact key to preventing the port's further development. Public opposition to the port has been very effective. The portrayal of the port has changed dramatically since it was first proposed. It's now recognized as controversial. This is significant because the perception of the port as politically sensitive affects the decision-making of executives whose companies may consider locating there. UEPA has tacitly acknowledged the danger of environmental harm without really addressing them through its greenwashing, which I talked about a little while ago. Activists' involvement in the UEPA meetings has demonstrated their lack of transparency. And here I'm referring to the respectful involvement, not the rather disorderly involvement of other groups. And the legislature's increasing use of unaccountable authorities like UEPA shows that they know that the policies that they're pursuing are unpopular. Here are some of the key points I've tried to make during this presentation. The Utah Inland Port will increase air pollution throughout the Salt Lake Valley. The effects will fall most heavily on residents of the West Side who already suffer unjustly from environmental contamination. The port will not be green. The Utah Inland Port Authority has ignored public demands to study the impacts of the port and have systematically worked to reduce public input at its meetings. The transloading facility gives Salt Lake City the opportunity to require a review of its impacts. Here are some key points I've tried to make during this presentation. The Utah Inland Port will increase air pollution throughout the Salt Lake Valley. The ill effects of the port will fall disproportionately on residents of the west side of the city. The port will not be green. The Inland Port Authority, UEPA, has ignored public demands to study the impacts of the port, and they have systematically reduced the opportunities for public participation in its meetings. The transloading facility offers Salt Lake City a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get some answers by requiring that the facility undergo a conditional use permit review. And finally, the port is not a done deal. There is a great deal that you, as a member of the public, can do in order to help stop this dangerous development. You can contact one of several local organizations that are active in the fight against the port: the Stop the Polluting Port Coalition, Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment, the Great Salt Lake Audubon, and others. You can demand that Salt Lake City's government require that the transloading facility be subjected to a conditional use permit review. You can contact your city council person, you can contact the mayor's office to demand that they subject this facility to the review. You can call and write your state representatives, particularly if they're Republicans. And finally, you can talk with your family and friends, because expanding public awareness of the port is key to any effort to oppose it. Thank you very much for your time and attention to this presentation about the Utah Inland Port, what Utahns need to know. Have a great day.